5. It is the summer of 1968. Michel is 10 years old. He has lived with his grandmother since he was 3, in the village of Chapny, in the Yonne, near the border with the Loire. Every morning he gets up early to make his grandmother's breakfast. He has made a list: how long the tea should brew, how many slices of bread and butter, and so on. He often stays in his room all morning reading Jules Verne, Pif le Chien, or The Famous Five, but he spends most of his time poring over a magazine he collects, The Universe Explained. There are articles about the structure of the elements, about how clouds form and bees swarm. He reads about the Taj Mahal, a palace built by an ancient king to honor his dead queen, about the death of Socrates, about Euclid's invention of geometry 3,000 years ago. In the afternoon, sitting in the garden with his back to the cherry tree, he can feel the springiness of the grass and the heat of the sun. The lettuces soak up the sun's rays and water from the ground. He has to water them when it gets dark. He sits in the garden reading The Universe Explained, or one of the books in a series called 100 Facts About. He absorbs knowledge. Sometimes he cycles cross-country, pedaling as hard as he can, filling his lungs with the taste of the infinite. He doesn't know it yet, but the infinity of childhood is brief. The countryside streams past. There is nothing left in Chalny but a small grocer's shop. Every Wednesday, though, the butcher's van comes around, the fishmonger's every Friday. His grandmother often makes creamed cod for lunch on Saturday. Michel does not know that this is his last summer in Chalny. His grandmother suffered a heart attack some months ago, and her daughters are already looking for a house in the suburbs of Paris where she can be closer to them. She is not strong enough to cope on her own anymore, nor to tend the garden all year long. Though Michel rarely plays with boys his own age, he gets along with his peers well enough. They consider him a bit of a loner. His schoolwork is excellent. He seems to understand everything effortlessly, and he is first in all his classes. Naturally, his grandmother is very proud. Yet he is neither bullied nor hated by his classmates. He is happy to let them copy his work in class, always waiting for the boy next to him to finish before turning the page. Despite his excellent academic record, he always sits at the back of the class. His is a fragile kingdom. 6. One summer, while he was still living in the Yonne, Michel spent an afternoon running through the fields with his cousin, Brigitte. A pretty, gentle girl of 16, she, some years later, would marry a complete bastard. It was the summer of 1967. She grabbed his hands, swinging him round and round until they collapsed in a heap on the freshly mown grass. He pressed himself into her warm breast. She was wearing a short skirt. Next morning they were covered in spots and itched all over. Thrombidium holocericum, also called the chigger, is plentiful in summer meadows. 2 millimeters in diameter, with a fat, fleshy, bright red body, it embeds its beak in the skin of mammals, causing unbearable itching. Linguatula rinaria, or tongueworm, is a parasite which lives in the frontal and maxillary sinuses of dogs and occasionally humans. The larva is oval and has a short tail and a sharp spike near the mouth. 2 pairs of limbs are armed with long claws. The body of the adult is between 18 and 85 millimeters long, flat, ribbed, translucent, and covered in barbed spines. In December 1968, Michel's grandmother moved to Seine-et-Marne to be closer to her daughters. Michel's daily life changed little at first. 50 kilometers from Paris, Crécy-en-Brie was still a pretty country village. Its old and dignified houses had been painted by Corot. Tourist brochures referred to it hopefully as Venice on the Brie, a reference to the network of canals that brought water from the Grand Morin. Few villagers commuted to Paris, most working for local businesses or in nearby Meaux. 2 months after the move, at a time when advertising had barely begun on France's then-only channel, his grandmother bought a television. And so, on 21st July 1969, Michel was able to watch the first steps of man on the moon live. 600 million people across the world watched with him. The broadcast, which lasted 3 or 4 hours, probably represents the culmination of the first stage of the great Western technological dream. Though he joined the local school in Crécy in midterm, Michel adapted quickly and had no difficulty passing his end-of-year exams. Every Thursday he bought Pif, newly relaunched, with its free gadget every week. Unlike most children his age, he did not buy it for the gadget, but for the adventure stories. Through a dazzling sweep of history and costume, these tales played out some simple moral values. Michel slowly realized that this moral system ran through all the stories. Ragnar the Viking, Teddy Ted and the Apache, Rahan, son of a savage age, and Nasdin Hodja, who duped viziers and caliphs. It was a realization that would profoundly affect him. Later, reading Nietzsche provoked only a brief irritation, and Kant served only to confirm what he already knew, that perfect morality is unique and universal. Nothing is added to it, and nothing changes over the course of time. It is not dependent on history, economics, sociology, or culture. It is not dependent on anything. Not determined, it determines. Not conditioned, it conditions. It is, in other words, absolute. Everyday morality is always a blend, variously proportioned, of perfect morality and other more ambiguous ideas, for the most part religious. The greater the proportion of pure morality in a particular system, the happier and more enduring the society. Ultimately, a society governed by the pure principles of universal morality could last until the end of the world. Michel liked all of the heroes in Pif, but his favorite was Black Wolf, the lone Indian. He was the synthesis of the noblest qualities of the Apache, the Sioux, and the Cheyenne. Black Wolf roamed the prairies ceaselessly with his horse Chinook and his wolf Tupi, instinctively coming to the aid of the weak. Black Wolf continually commented on the transcendent ethic which underpinned his actions. Often he referred to poetic proverbs from the Lakota and the Cree, sometimes more prosaically to the law of the prairie. Years later, Michel still considered him Kant's ideal hero, always acting as if he were, by his maxims, a legitimating member of the universal kingdom of ends. Some episodes, like The Leather Bracelet, in which the extraordinary character of the old Cheyenne chief searches for the stars, broke free of the straitjacket of the adventure story for a world that was more poetic, more moral. He was less interested in television. Every week, however, his heart in his mouth, he watched the animal kingdom. Graceful animals like gazelles and antelopes spent their days in abject terror, while lions and panthers lived out their lives in listless imbecility, punctuated by explosive bursts of cruelty. They slaughtered weaker animals, dismembered and devoured the sick and the old before falling back into a brutish sleep, where the only activity was that of the parasites feeding on them from within. Some of these parasites were hosts to smaller parasites, which in turn were a breeding ground for viruses. Snakes moved among the trees, their fangs bared, ready to strike at bird or mammal, only to be ripped apart by hawks. The pompous, half-witted voice of Claude Darget, filled with awe and unjustifiable admiration, narrated these atrocities. Michel trembled with indignation, but as he watched, the unshakable conviction grew that nature, taken as a whole, was a repulsive cesspit. All in all, nature deserved to be wiped out in a holocaust, and man's mission on Earth was probably to do just that. In April 1970, Pif gave away a free gift, which was to become famous: sea monkeys. Each copy came with a sachet of poudre de vie, the eggs of a tiny marine crustacean, Artemia salina, which had spent thousands of years in suspended animation. The process of bringing them back to life was complicated. Water had to be allowed to settle for 3 days, then warmed. Only then was the powder added and the water stirred gently. In the days that followed, the bowl had to be kept near a source of light. Warm water had to be added regularly to compensate for evaporation, and the water stirred to keep it oxygenated. Some weeks later, the bowl was swarming with a multitude of translucent crustaceans, indisputably alive, if faintly revolting. Not knowing what to do with them, Michel ended up tipping them into the river Morin. The complete adventure story in the same issue concerned the boyhood of Rahan, and told how he had come to his vocation as a lone hero in Paleolithic Europe. When still a child, he had seen his tribe wiped out by an erupting volcano. As he knelt by his dying father, Crow the Wise, the old man gave him a necklace of 3 hawk's talons. Each talon symbolized one of the qualities of those who walked upright: the first, loyalty; the second, courage; and the third, and most important, kindness. Rahan had worn the necklace ever since, always trying to prove himself worthy of it. In the long, narrow garden of the house in Crécy was a cherry tree, only slightly smaller than the one in Michel's garden in the Yonne. There he would sit and read The Universe Explained and 100 Facts About. For his 12th birthday, his grandmother gave him my first chemistry set. Chemistry was mysterious and strange. It was much more exciting than mechanics or electricity. Each substance came in a separate tube. Each had its own color and texture, elements forever distinct from each other, but simply juxtaposing them could produce violent reactions, which in a flash could create some new substance. As he was reading in the garden one afternoon in July, Michel realized that the chemical basis of life could have been completely different. Atoms with identical valency but higher atomic weight could have taken the place of the carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen which made up all living things. On another planet, with different temperature and atmospheric pressure, the stuff of life could be silicon, sulfur, and phosphorus, or germanium, selenium, and arsenic, or even tin, tellurium, and antimony. He had no one he could really talk to about these things. At his request, his grandmother bought him several books on biochemistry. 7. Bruno's earliest memory was one of humiliation. He was 4 years old and attending the Parc La Pellier nursery school in Algiers. It was an autumn afternoon, and the teacher had shown the boys how to make necklaces out of leaves. The girls, most of them in white dresses, sat on a small bank, watching, their faces already betraying a hint of dumb female resignation. The ground was strewn with golden leaves, mostly chestnut and plain. One after another, his friends finished their necklaces and went to place them around the necks of their little girlfriends, but he could not seem to finish his. The leaves broke and crumbled in his hands. How could he tell them that he too needed love? How could he let them know without a necklace? He started to cry with rage, yet the teacher did not come to help. Class had finished, and the children stood up and began to file out of the park. The nursery school closed shortly afterward. His grandparents lived in a beautiful apartment on the boulevard Edgar Quinet. Like many in the center of Algiers, it was designed in the bourgeois style of the great Haussmann buildings in Paris. A central hall, 20 meters long, ran the length of the apartment, ending in a drawing room from whose balcony the whole of the White City was at one's feet. Many years later, when Bruno was already an embittered middle-aged cynic, he could still remember himself, aged 4, pedaling furiously down the dark hallway toward the shimmering portal of the balcony. It was at moments like this that he had come closest to true happiness. His grandfather died in 1962. In temperate climates, the body of a bird or mammal first attracts specific species of flies, Musca courtonura. But once decomposition sets in, these are joined by others, particularly Calliphora and Lucilia. Under the combined action of bacteria and the digestive juices disgorged by the larvae, the corpse begins to liquefy and becomes a ferment of butyric and ammoniac reactions. In 3 short months, the flies will have completed their work. They are succeeded by hordes of Coleoptera, specifically Dermestes, and Lepidoptera, like Aglossa pinguinalis, which feed on fatty tissue. Larvae of the Piophila petitionis feed on the fermenting proteins, with other Coleoptera called Corinites. The now decomposed cadaver becomes a host to Acaridae, which absorb the last traces of residual moisture. Desiccated and mummified, the corpse still harbors parasites, the larvae of beetles, Aglossa cuprealis, and Tiniola bacilliella maggots, which complete the cycle. Bruno could still see the beautiful deep black coffin with the silver cross. It was a soothing, even happy image. He knew his grandfather would be at peace in such a magnificent coffin. He did not learn about Acaridae and the host of parasites with names like Italian film stars until later. But even now the image of his grandfather's coffin remained a happy one. He remembered his grandmother sitting on a suitcase in the middle of the kitchen on the day they arrived in Marseille. Cockroaches scuttled between the cracks in the tiles. It was probably then that she began to lose her mind. The litany of troubles in those few short weeks had overwhelmed her. The slow agony of her husband's death, the hurried departure from Algiers, and the arduous search for an apartment, finding one at last in a filthy housing project in the northeast of Marseille. She had never set foot in France before. Her daughter had deserted her and hadn't even attended her father's funeral. Deep down, Bruno's grandmother felt certain there had been a mistake. Someone, somewhere, had made a dreadful mistake. She picked herself up and carried on for another 5 years. She bought new furniture, set up a bed in the dining room for Bruno, and enrolled him in a local primary school. Every afternoon she came to collect him. He was ashamed of the small, frail, shriveled woman who took his hand to lead him home. All the other children had parents. Divorce was still rare in those days. At night she would replay her life over and over, trying to discover how it had ended like this. She rarely managed to find sleep before dawn. The apartment had low ceiling, and, in the summer, the rooms were stuffy and unbearably hot. During the day she puttered around in old slippers, talking to herself without realizing it. Sometimes she would repeat a sentence 50 times. Her daughter's memory haunted her. Her own father's funeral, and she didn't come. She went from one room to another, carrying a wash rag or a saucepan whose purpose she had already forgotten. Her own father's funeral. Her own father's funeral. Her slippers scuffled on the tiled floors. Terrified, Bruno curled himself into a ball in his bed. He knew things could only get worse. Sometimes she would get up early, still in dressing gown and curlers, and whisper to herself, "Algeria is French." And then the scuffling would begin. She walked back and forth in the tiny two-room apartment, staring at some fixed, faraway point. "France, France," she repeated slowly, her voice dying away. She had always been a good cook. Here it became her only pleasure. She would cook lavish meals for Bruno, as though entertaining a party of 10. Peppers marinated in olive oil, anchovies, potato salad. Sometimes there would be 5 hors d'oeuvres before a main course of stuffed zucchini or rabbit with olives, from time to time a couscous. The one thing she had never succeeded in mastering was baking, but every week, when she collected her pension, she would bring home pastries, boxes of nougat, candied chestnuts, and almond cakes. As time went by, Bruno became a fat, fearful child. She herself ate little or nothing. On Sunday morning she would sleep in, and Bruno would climb into her bed and press himself against her emaciated body. Sometimes he dreamed of getting up in the night, taking a knife and stabbing her through the heart. He could see himself break down in tears beside the body. In his imagination, he always died soon after her. Late in 1966, she received a letter from her daughter. Bruno's father, with whom she still exchanged cards at Christmas, had given her their address in Marseille. In the letter, Janine expressed no real regret about the past, which she mentioned in the following sentence. "I heard Daddy died and you moved to France." She explained that she was leaving California and returning to the south of France. She gave no forwarding address. One morning in March 1967, while making deep-fried zucchini, the old woman knocked over the pan of boiling oil. She managed to drag herself into the hallway, where her screams alerted the neighbors. When Bruno came home from school, Madame Houellebecq, who lived upstairs, met him at the door. She took him to the hospital, where for a few minutes he was allowed to see his grandmother. Her burns were hidden beneath the sheets. She had been given a great deal of morphine, but she recognized Bruno and took his hand in hers. Some minutes later, the child was led away. Her heart gave out later that night. For the second time, Bruno found himself face to face with death, and for a second time he almost completely failed to grasp its significance. Years later, when he was praised for a composition or a history essay, his first thought was to tell his grandmother. He would remember then that she was dead, but only rarely did he face this fact. It did not interrupt the dialogue between them. When offered a place at the university to study modern literature, he discussed this with her, though by now he was losing faith. He had bought 2 boxes of candied chestnuts for the occasion, which proved to be their last major conversation. Once he completed his studies and taken his first teaching job, he realized something had changed. He could not reach her anymore. The image of his grandmother dissolved and disappeared. On the morning after her funeral, he witnessed something strange. His father and mother, neither of whom he had seen before, were discussing what should be done with him. They were in the main room of the Marseille apartment. Bruno sat on his bed and listened. To hear other people talk about him was disconcerting, especially as they seemed completely oblivious to his presence. He could almost forget that he was there. Not an unpleasant feeling. Though the conversation was to have a profound impact on his life, at the time what they were saying did not seem to concern him directly. Later, when he thought about the conversation, as he often did, He felt nothing. As he sat listening to them that day, he could feel no link, no physical connection between himself and these two impossibly tall and youthful people. It was decided that he should be enrolled at boarding school in September. He would spend weekends with his father in Paris. His mother would try to take him on vacation from time to time. Bruno did not object. These people did not seem hostile. In any case, his real life was the one he had shared with his grandmother. 8. The Omega Male. Bruno leans against the sink. He has taken off his pajama top, and the folds of his pale stomach press against the cold porcelain. He is 11 years old. About to brush his teeth, as he does every night, he hopes to get out of the bathroom without anything happening. When Wilmar comes up from behind and pushes him, Bruno backs away, trembling. He knows what will happen next. "Leave me alone," he says feebly. Now Pele also comes over. He is short, stocky, and very strong. He slaps Bruno hard, and the boy starts to cry. They push him to the ground, grab his feet, and drag him across the floor to the toilets. They rip off his pajama bottoms. His penis is hairless, still that of a child. The two hold him by the hair and force his mouth open. Pele takes a toilet brush and scrubs Bruno's face. He can taste shit. He screams. Brasseur joins the others. At 14, he is the oldest boy in the 6e. He takes out his prick, which to Bruno seems huge, then stands over the boy and pisses on his face. The night before, he'd forced Bruno to suck him off and lick his ass, but he didn't feel like it tonight. "This'll put hair on your chest," he jokes, "and your balls." He nods, and the others spread shaving cream on his genitals. Brasseur opens a straight razor and brings the blade close. Terrified, Bruno shits himself. One night in March 1968, a prefect found him curled up on the floor of the toilets in the courtyard, naked and covered in shit. He found a pair of pajamas for the boy and took him to see Cohen, the housemaster. Bruno was terrified of being forced to squeal on Brasseur, but Cohen was calm, though he'd been dragged out of bed in the middle of the night. Unlike the prefects who reported to him, he treated the boys with the same respect he extended to his colleagues. This was his third boarding school, and certainly not the toughest. He knew that victims almost always refused to inform on their tormentors. The only thing he could do was penalize the prefect in charge of the 6e dormitory. Most of the boys were ignored by their parents, making Cohen the sole authority figure in their lives. He tried to keep a close eye on his pupils and preempt trouble, but with only 5 prefects for 200 boys, this was impossible. After Bruno left, he made himself a cup of coffee and leafed through his files. Though he could prove nothing, he knew the culprits were Pele and Brasseur. If he caught them, he would have them expelled. 1 or 2 cruel elements were enough to reduce the others to a state of savagery. In early adolescence, boys can be particularly savage. They gang up and are only too eager to torture and humiliate the weak. Cohen had no illusions about the depths to which the human animal could sink when not constrained by law. He had built a fearsome reputation since his arrival at the school in Meaux. He knew he represented the ultimate sanction, without which the treatment meted out to boys like Bruno would know no bounds. Bruno was happy to repeat a year, since Pele, Brasseur, and Wilmar had graduated to the 5e and would be in a different dormitory. Unfortunately, a ministerial directive taken after the riots of 1968 introduced an auto-disciplinary system in boarding schools and a reduction in staffing. The decision was very much of its time and resulted in considerable savings in salaries. It became easier for pupils to move about at night, and soon the bullies took to staging raids on the younger boys' dormitories at least once a week. They would bring 1 or 2 victims back to the 5e dormitory, where the ceremonies would begin. Toward the end of December, Jean-Michel Kempf, a nervous, skinny boy who had arrived earlier that year, threw himself out the window to escape his tormentors. The boy was lucky to escape with multiple fractures. The fall easily could have been fatal. His ankle was badly broken, and though surgeons worked hard to reassemble the bone fragments, he would be crippled for the rest of his life. Cohen organized an inquiry, which confirmed his suspicions, and despite the boy's protestations of innocence, he suspended Pele for 3 days. For the most part, animal societies are structured according to a hierarchy in which rank relates directly to the physical strength of each member. The most dominant male in the group is known as the alpha male, his nearest rival, the beta male, and so on down to the weakest of the group, the omega male. Combat rituals generally determine status within the group. Weaker animals try to better their position by challenging those above them. A dominant position confers certain privileges, first to feed and to couple with females in the group. The weakest animal, however, can generally avoid combat by adopting such submissive postures as crouching or presenting the rump. Bruno, however, found himself in a less auspicious position. While dominance and brutality are commonplace in the animal kingdom, among higher primates, notably the chimpanzee, Pan troglodytes, weaker animals suffer acts of gratuitous cruelty. This tendency is at its greatest in primitive human societies. Compassion, the capacity to identify with the suffering of others, develops later. This is quickly systematized into a moral order. At the boarding school in Meaux, Jean Cohen personified that moral order and did not intend to deviate from it. He did not believe that the Nazis had perverted Nietzsche's philosophy. In Cohen's opinion, the ideas manifest in Nietzsche's philosophy, the rejection of compassion, the elevation of individuals above the moral order, and the triumph of the will, led directly to Nazism. Given his qualifications and his time at the school, Cohen could have been headmaster. He remained a housemaster by choice. He wrote repeatedly to the Ministry of Education to complain about the cutback in boarding school staff, but received no reply. In captivity, a male kangaroo, Macropus, will often interpret the zookeeper's upright posture as a threat. If the keeper hunches his shoulders, adopting the non-aggressive stance of a peaceful kangaroo, the animal's violent impulses diffuse. Jean Cohen did not intend to become a peaceful kangaroo. The savagery of Michel, a normal stage in the development of the ego even in lesser animals, had crippled one of his classmates. Boys like Bruno would probably be psychologically scarred for life. When he summoned Brasseur to his office, he fully intended to make his contempt obvious, to let the boy know he was about to be expelled. On Sunday evenings, when his father drove him back in the Mercedes, Bruno would start to tremble as they reached the outskirts of Nontoy-les-Meaux. The school hall was decorated with bas-reliefs of illustrious former pupils, Courteline and Moissan. Georges Courteline was a French writer whose stories parodied the absurdities of the bourgeoisie. Henri Moissan, a chemist who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1906, had isolated silicon and fluorine and pioneered the use of the electric oven. Bruno's father always arrived just in time for dinner at 7 o'clock. Bruno usually only managed to eat at lunchtime, when they ate with the day pupils. At dinner, only the boarders were present. They sat in groups of 8, with the senior at the head of each table. The seniors served themselves and then spat into the bowl so the younger boys wouldn't touch it. Every Sunday, Bruno tried to talk to his father, and each time he decided it was hopeless. His father believed it was good for a boy to learn to defend himself, and it was true that other boys, some no older than Bruno, fought back. They kicked and punched until, eventually, they earned the respect of their elders. At 42, Serge Clément was a success. While his parents ran a small grocer shop in Petit Clamart, Serge already owned 3 clinics specializing in plastic surgery. One in Neuilly, another in Vessinay, and a third near Lausanne in Switzerland. When his ex-wife left to live in California, he had taken over the management of the clinic in Caen, sending her half of the profits. He had not done any surgical work for some time, but was, as they say, a good manager. He didn't really know how to behave with his son, though. He wanted to do his best for the boy, as long as it did not require too much of his time, and he felt a certain guilt. He usually would arrange not to see his girlfriends when Bruno came for the weekend. He bought prepared meals from the delicatessen, and they ate together, then watched television. Serge had no idea how to play games. Sometimes Bruno would get up in the middle of the night and go to the fridge. He would pour cornflakes into a bowl, add milk and cream and a thick layer of sugar. Then he would eat. He would eat bowl after bowl of cornflakes until he felt sick. His stomach felt heavy. He felt almost happy. 9. From a moral standpoint, 1970 was marked by a substantial increase in the consumption of the erotic, despite the intervention of vigilant censors. The musical Hair, which was to bring the sexual liberation of the 1960s to the general public, was a huge success. Bare breasts spread quickly across the beaches of the Riviera. In a few short months, the number of sex shops in Paris leapt from 3 to 45. In September, Michel started the Quatrième and took German as his second language. It was in his German class that he met Annabelle. At the time, Michel had only the most modest idea of what happiness might be. In fact, he had never thought about it. His views were those of his grandmother, who had instilled them in her children. His grandmother was Catholic and voted for de Gaulle. Both her daughters had married communists, but this had not changed her view of the world. She was of the generation who, as children, had suffered the hardships of war, and then, at 20, celebrated the liberation. These are the ideas they wished to bequeath to their children. A woman stays at home and does the housework, her work made easier by a variety of electrical appliances, allowing her plenty of time to spend with her children. A man goes off to his job, but, thanks to automation, works shorter hours, and his work is less arduous. Couples are happy and faithful. They live in a nice house in the suburbs. In their spare time, they may enjoy gardening and crafts and appreciate the arts, or they may prefer to travel and discover other countries, other cultures, other lifestyles. Jacob Wilkening was born in Leeuwarden in the Netherlands. He arrived in France at the age of 4 and had only a vague recollection of his Dutch childhood. In 1946, he married the sister of one of his best friends. She was 17 years old and had never been with a man. He worked for a time in a factory making microscopes before setting up his own business crafting precision lenses, principally subcontracting for Ingenieur and Pathé. The business flourished. There was no competition from Japan in those days, and France produced lenses that were the equal of Schneider and Zeiss. The couple had 2 sons, born in 1948 and 1951, and, much later, in 1958, a daughter, Annabelle. Born into a happy family. In the 25 years they had been married, her parents had never had a serious argument. Annabelle knew that she was destined for the same. She began to think about such things the summer before she met Michel, when she was going on 13. Somewhere in the world was a boy she had never met, a boy who knew nothing about her, but with whom she would spend the rest of her life. She would try to make him happy, and he would try to make her happy as well, but she was disturbed that she didn't have the slightest idea what he would look like. A girl her age had expressed the same concern in a letter to the Disney comic Le Journal de Mickey. The answer was meant to be reassuring, and ended with these words: "Don't worry, little Coralie. When you see him, you'll know." They began to spend time together doing their German homework. Michel lived just across the street, barely 50 meters away. More and more often, they spent Thursdays and Sundays together. Michel would arrive at Annabelle's house just after lunch, when her little brother would look out the window and announce, "Annabelle, it's your fiancé." She would blush, but her parents did not make fun of her. She realized that she really liked Michel. An odd boy. He knew nothing about soccer or rock music. He was not unpopular at school, but although he talked to a number of people, he kept his distance. Before Annabelle, he had never invited anyone to his house. He was a solitary child, used to his own thoughts and dreams. Little by little, he grew accustomed to her presence. They often set out on their bicycles up the hill at Voulangy, then walked through the woods and fields until they came to the cliff that towered above the valley of the Grand Morin. They walked back through the meadows, slowly getting to know each other. 10. Caroline Yesayan is to blame for everything. That same year, things improved a little for Bruno when he went back to school. Now, in the Quatrième, he was one of the big boys. From the Quatrième to the final year, the boys slept in a different wing, in dormitories divided into 4-bed cubicles. To the bullies, he had already been destroyed, humiliated. They moved on to new victims. This was also the year Bruno discovered girls. Sometimes, not often, there was a joint outing for the local boarding schools. On Thursday afternoons, if the weather was good, They would go to a sort of man-made beach on the banks of the Marne outside Meaux. There was a cafe nearby with pinball machines and table soccer, though its real attraction was a python. The boys liked to torment the animal, tapping their fingers on the sides of the vivarium. The vibrations drove the snake wild, and it would throw itself against the glass until it knocked itself unconscious. One afternoon in October, Bruno found himself talking to Patricia Hohweiler. She was an orphan and had to stay in school year-round, except for the holidays, when she went to stay with her uncle in Alsace. She was blonde and thin and talked very quickly, her animated face occasionally slipping into an odd smile. The following week, he was shocked to see her sitting, legs spread, on Brasseur's knee. His arm was around her waist, and he was kissing her. Bruno drew no particular conclusions from this. If the thugs who had terrorized him for years were popular with the girls, it was because they were the only ones who dared to hit on them. He had noticed that Pelé, Villemar, and even Brasseur himself never bullied the younger boys if there were girls around. Pupils in the Quatrième were allowed to join the Film Society, which held screenings every Thursday evening in the boys' assembly hall, though girls were allowed to attend. One night in December, just before Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, started, Bruno took the seat next to Caroline Yesayan. Toward the end of the film, having thought about it for more than an hour, he very gently placed his left hand on her thigh. For a few wonderful seconds, 5, 7, surely no more than 10, nothing happened. She didn't move. Bruno felt a warm glow flood his body and thought he might faint. Then, without saying a word, she brushed his hand away. Years later, fairly often actually, when some little whore was sucking him off, Bruno would remember those few seconds of terrifying joy. He also remembered the moment when Caroline Yesayan moved his hand away. What the boy had felt was something pure, something gentle, something that predates sex or sensual fulfillment. It was the simple desire to reach out and touch a loving body, to be held in loving arms. Tenderness is a deeper instinct than seduction, which is why it is so difficult to give up hope. If Bruno had touched Caroline Yesayan's arm that evening, she almost certainly would have let him, and it probably would have been the beginning of something. While they were waiting in line, she had deliberately struck up a conversation and had kept a seat free to give him an opportunity to sit beside her. During the film, she had put her arm on the armrest between them. She had noticed Bruno before, and she fancied him. That evening, she was hoping against hope that he would hold her hand. Why did Bruno touch her thigh? Probably because Caroline Yesayan's thigh was bare, and in his innocence he could not imagine it was bare for no reason. As he grew older and remembered his boyhood with disgust, he came to see this as the defining moment of his life. It all appeared to him in the light of cold and unchangeable fact. On that December evening in 1970, Caroline Yesayan had it in her power to undo all the humiliation and the sadness of his childhood. After this first failure, for after she gently removed his hand, he never spoke to her again, everything became much more difficult. Of course, it was not really Caroline Yesayan's fault, rather the reverse. Caroline Yesayan, a little Armenian girl with doe eyes and long curly black hair, who had found herself, after endless family wranglings, among the dark and gloomy buildings of the boarding school in Meaux. Caroline Yesayan alone gave Bruno a reason to believe in humanity. If it all had ended in a terrible emptiness, it was because of something so trivial that it was grotesque. 30 years later, Bruno was convinced that, taken in context, the episode could be summed up in one sentence. Caroline Yesayan's miniskirt was to blame for everything. In putting his hand on Caroline Yesayan's thigh, Bruno might as well have been asking her to marry him. The beginning of his adolescence coincided with a period of social change. Aside from a handful of precursors, of whom his parents, of course, were a depressing example, the previous generation had made a fierce and unwavering connection between marriage, sex, and love. The rise of the bourgeoisie and the rapid economic changes of the 1950s had led to a decline in arranged marriages, except in the rapidly dwindling aristocracy, where lineage was still of real significance. The Catholic Church, which had always frowned upon sex outside of marriage, welcomed the shift toward the love match. It was closer to Catholic doctrine. Male and female created he them, and brought its ideal world of peace, fidelity, and love a step closer. The Communist Party, which was the only spiritual power that could rival the church at the time, was fighting for almost identical objectives. Consequently, young people in the 1950s, without exception, waited impatiently to fall in love. As the desertion of the countryside and the concurrent disappearance of village communities allowed the choice of a future spouse to be made from an almost infinite selection, just as the choice itself became of the utmost importance. At Sarcelles, in September 1955, a new political movement dedicated to the preservation of the extended family was launched, proof in itself that society had now been reduced to the nuclear family. It would be fair to say that the late 1950s and early 1960s were the golden age of romantic love, a time we remember today through the songs of Jean Ferrat and early Françoise Hardy. But it was at precisely this time that the consumption of prurient mass-market entertainment from North America, the songs of Elvis Presley, the films of Marilyn Monroe, was spreading all over Western Europe. Along with the refrigerators and washing machines designed to make for a happy couple, came the transistor radio and the record player, which would teach the adolescent how to flirt. The distinction between true love and flirtation, latent during the 60s, exploded in the early 70s in magazines like Mademoiselle Âge Tendre and Wynne, and crystallized around the central question of the era: how far can you go before you get married? The libidinal, hedonistic American option received great support from the liberal press. The first issue of Actuel appeared in October 1970, and Charlie Hebdo in November. Although their politics were notionally left-wing, these magazines embraced the ideals of the entertainment industry: the destruction of Judeo-Christian values, the supremacy of youth and individual freedom. Torn between these conflicting pressures, teen magazines hastily cobbled together a compromise that can be summed up in the following life history. In the first stage, say from 12 to 18, a girl would go out with several boys. The semantic ambivalence of the term reflected a very real behavioral ambiguity. What did going out with a boy actually mean? Did it mean kissing, or did it include the more profound joys of petting, or of heavy petting, or even of full sexual intercourse? Should you allow a boy to touch your breasts? Should you take off your panties? And what should you do with this thing? For Patricia Hohweiler and Caroline Yesayan, the problem was far from simple. Their favorite magazines gave vague, often contradictory answers. In the second stage, once she left high school, the same girl needed a serious relationship, referred to in German magazines as big love. Now the defining question was, should I move in with Jeremy? This was the second and final stage. The flaw in the solution offered by girls' magazines, arbitrarily recommending contradictory forms of behavior in consecutive periods of a girl's life, only became apparent some years later with the inexorable rise in the divorce rate. Nevertheless, for many years, girls, naive and already disoriented by the speed of social change, accepted these improbable rules and tried their best to stick to them. Things were very different for Annabelle. Last thing at night, before she went to sleep, she thought about Michel, and every morning she was overjoyed to see him again. If something funny or interesting happened at school, her first thought was of the moment she could tell Michel about it. On days when they could not see each other for some reason, she was worried and upset. During the summer holidays, her family had a house in the Gironde. She wrote to him every day. The letters were more sisterly than passionate, and her feelings more aglow than a consuming fire. But even if she were reluctant to admit it to herself, the truth slowly dawned on her. On the first try, without looking, without really wanting to, she had found true love. Her first love was the real thing. There would not be another, and such a question did not even arise. It was a plausible scenario, according to Mademoiselle Âge Tendre, but one did well to be cautious, as it almost never happened. There were, however, rare, almost miraculous cases that demonstrated it was possible. And if it happened to you, It was the most wonderful thing in the world.